The sea has always been a merciless teacher, its waves whispering warnings and its storms rewriting history in ways we've barely begun to understand. Picture this, a fleet of mighty medieval ships, their sails straining against the wind, vanishing beneath the waves in a single night, not in battle, but at the whim of a tempest so brutal it left no survivors to tell the tale. Or consider the humble fishing vessel whose accidental discovery of a hidden reef forced entire kingdoms to redraw their maps, altering trade routes that had stood for centuries. These aren't just stories of loss, they're turning points, moments when the sea itself reached into the course of human events and left nothing unchanged. What if I told you that some of the most pivotal moments in medieval naval history weren't glorious victories or epic battles, but disasters so devastating they forced entire civilizations to rethink how they faced the ocean? From the icy waters of the North Sea to the sun-drenched coasts of the Mediterranean, shipwrecks and storms shaped the destiny of nations in ways that still echo today. A single poorly designed hull could doom a kingdom's economy. A misunderstood current might decide the fate of a war. These weren't just accidents, they were catalysts, sparking innovations in shipbuilding, navigation, and even diplomacy. The sea didn't just test sailors, it tested empires. So why do these forgotten tragedies matter? Because hidden beneath the silt and seaweed are stories of human ingenuity, of communities rebuilding, of lessons hard-won and passed down through generations. When a storm swallowed a fleet, survivors didn't just mourn, they studied, they adapted, they forged stronger ships, sharper navigation tools, and smarter strategies. Today, we're setting sail into the shadows of history to uncover 27 of these little-known maritime disasters, each one a ripple that grew into a wave. You'll meet the fishermen who stumbled upon dangers no chart had recorded, the admirals who learned too late the cost of ignoring the sea's warnings, and the ordinary sailors whose sacrifices quietly reshaped the world. This isn't just a list of wrecks, it's a map to understanding how the medieval world learned to conquer the unconquerable. So ready your sea legs, the past is waiting, and its lessons are more surprising than you think. To grasp just how much a single maritime disaster could reshape the medieval world, let's take a step back and consider the sheer fragility of life at sea in that era. Imagine a world without weather forecasts, without lifeboats, without even basic charts of the ocean's hidden dangers. A ship wasn't just a vessel, it carried a kingdom's grain, a city's wealth, a nation's soldiers. When one vanished, the shockwaves rippled far beyond the shoreline. Take the case of the English wine trade in the 13th century, where a single storm sinking a convoy of merchant ships could leave entire towns without their most vital import for months. Or consider the Hanseatic League, a powerhouse of northern European trade, whose dominance was built as much on avoiding the mistakes of past shipwrecks as on shrewd business deals. What made these disasters so transformative wasn't just the loss of lives or cargo, it was how they exposed systemic flaws. A poorly designed cog, overloaded with wool and salt, might capsize in a sudden squall, prompting shipwrights to experiment with deeper keels and sturdier masts. A fleet scattered by uncharted currents could inspire rulers to fund the first accurate coastal maps. Even superstition played a role. After a mysterious disappearance of ships near a rocky cape, sailors might refuse to sail there, forcing traders to find new routes that later became thriving hubs of commerce. The sea didn't just punish mistakes, it revealed opportunities. Perhaps the most striking example of this ripple effect comes from the Mediterranean, where the wreck of a single Venetian galley in 1382 led to a revolution in maritime law. The ship, laden with spices and silk, sank because its captain ignored warnings about overloading, a common practice to maximize profit. The disaster was so costly that Venice enacted strict cargo limits, a policy soon adopted by rival city-states. Suddenly, the race for profit was tempered by shared rules, laying the groundwork for modern shipping regulations. It's a reminder that behind every medieval disaster was a human story of ambition, of oversight, and ultimately of resilience. The ocean's lessons were harsh, but those who listened prospered. Now, let's turn to the first of our 27 disasters, one that didn't just change ships, it changed empires. Off the coast of Sicily in 1284, a storm unlike any in living memory swallowed an entire armada, and in its wake, the balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted forever. The winter of 1029 was meant to mark the peak of King Canute the Great's ambition, a fleet of longships, each carved from oak and powered by the muscle of seasoned Norse rowers, slicing through the frigid waters toward Denmark. This wasn't just an invasion, it was the culmination of a lifetime spent weaving Norse power into the fabric of Europe, but the North Sea had other plans. Without warning, a squall descended like a hammer, churning the waves into walls of black water. By dawn, dozens of ships had vanished, swallowed whole. There were no survivors to recount their final moments, no wreckage to hint at their fate, only silence, and a king's dreams dashed against the rocks. What made this disaster so pivotal wasn't just the loss of lives or ships, but the power vacuum it created. For centuries, Scandinavian rulers had dominated Baltic trade, their networks stretching from Dublin to Novgorod. But with Canute's fleet gone, the delicate balance of power shattered. English and German merchants, once overshadowed by Norse dominance, seized the opportunity. Ports like Bremen and London flourished, their docks suddenly free of Viking tolls and tariffs. The North Sea, once a Norse lake, became a crossroads for new players, all because of a single storm's timing. Yet the legacy of this disaster wasn't purely economic. Sailors began to notice patterns in the wind, the way clouds gathered before a squall. Viking captains, once fearless in the face of tempests, started delaying voyages at the first sign of darkening skies. Oral traditions that had dismissed weather warnings as superstition now treated them as gospel. Shipwrights, too, adapted experimenting with deeper hulls to steady their vessels against sudden waves. The sea had taught a brutal lesson, but it was one that would echo through generations of sailors. But while Canute's fleet faded into legend, the Mediterranean was about to witness a catastrophe of its own, one that would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. Off the coast of Sicily, a storm was gathering that would make even the North Sea's fury seem tame. Constantinople, in the spring of 1042, was a city balanced on a knife's edge, its towering walls and golden domes masking a vulnerability few dared to acknowledge. The empire's lifeline stretched across the Aegean, a fragile chain of 30 grain ships carrying Egypt's harvest to feed 500,000 mouths. Then came the storm. Not the usual seasonal squall, but a tempest so violent it ripped masts from hulls and scattered seasoned captains like toys. When the waves finally stilled, not a single ship remained. The docks stood empty, the granaries echoed, and within weeks, hunger twisted into fury as bread riots erupted through the city's marble streets. Emperor Michael V, scrambling to appease the mob, was dragged from the palace and blinded, a brutal end to a reign undone by the sea's indifference. What transformed this disaster from tragedy to turning point was Constantinople's ruthless pragmatism. The Byzantines didn't just rebuild their fleet, they reinvented it. Shipwrights abandoned the sleek, oared galleys that had dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries, recognizing their fatal flaw: shallow drafts that rolled like logs in heavy swells. Instead, they modeled new vessels after the Arab dhows that weathered storms with their deeper hulls and lateen sails. These weren't just ships, they were floating fortresses, their holds divided into watertight compartments to prevent total loss. Even more revolutionary was the empire's decision to fracture its supply lines. No longer would Egypt's grain sail a single perilous route. Cargoes now came from Crimea, Sicily, even the Black Sea coast, ensuring no single storm could starve the city again. The ripple effects reached far beyond Constantinople's walls. Venetian merchants, quick to exploit the crisis, secured lucrative contracts as alternate suppliers, fueling the rise of a maritime republic that would one day challenge Byzantium itself. Meanwhile, northern European traders took note of those deeper hulls, adapting the design for their own storm-tossed waters. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was written in ink. Byzantine admiralty courts began compiling the first systematic records of ship losses, wind patterns, and cargo values. These weren't mere ledgers, they were the birth of risk management, a medieval insurance system born from starvation and chaos. Yet even as the Byzantines mastered their waters, a new threat was brewing where the Baltic met the North Sea. There, an entirely different kind of maritime disaster was about to unfold, one that would prove storms weren't the only force capable of sinking empires. The waters off Rügen Island should have been safe, a well-traveled route where Danish merchant cogs lumbered home with Baltic amber and Russian furs. But on a moonless night in 1136, the sea betrayed them. First came the flickers of light in the distance, dancing like will-o'-the-wisps. Then the horror dawned. Those weren't fishing boats but fire ships, their hulls packed with pitch-soaked timber, set adrift by Wendish pirates. With no room to maneuver in the narrow strait, the Danish convoy became a floating inferno. By morning, 12 ships and their priceless cargoes lay as charred husks beneath the waves, and the balance of power in the Baltic had shifted overnight. What made this ambush more than just another pirate raid was its chilling precision. The Wends Slavic sea raiders, long dismissed as nuisances, had exploited two fatal weaknesses: the merchants' predictable routes and their ships' sluggish handling. Danish cogs, built for cargo space over speed, couldn't outrun the flames. The disaster sent shockwaves from Novgorod to Norway, laying bare a truth no kingdom wanted to admit: Baltic trade was defenseless. But from the ashes rose an unexpected solution. German merchants in Lübeck, tired of paying ransom for their goods, began pooling resources to arm escort vessels. These weren't royal navies, but floating cooperatives where shipwrights shared designs for faster, nimbler hulls with raised forecastles to repel boarders. Within decades, this loose network would crystallize into the Hanseatic League, turning pirate hunters into the CEOs of medieval Europe's first trade monopoly. Yet the League's greatest innovation wasn't its swords or sails, it was bureaucracy. After the Rügen attack, Hanseatic merchants pioneered standardized contracts specifying everything from cargo stowage to storm protocols. A ship sailing from Bergen to Bruges now carried identical manifests, written in the same hand, making theft nearly impossible. Even piracy adapted. Wendish raiders, finding hardened targets, shifted to collecting protection fees, an early form of maritime insurance. The sea hadn't become safer, but it had become calculable. But just as human ingenuity tamed one threat, the Baltic unveiled another. In 1348, a storm surge would strike the Hanseatic heartland with a violence that made pirate raids seem trivial, a reminder that no alliance could outmatch the ocean's wrath. The summer of 1219 should have been a season of holy conquest, with the Fifth Crusade's fleet massing in northern ports. their hulls packed with knights, pilgrims, and siege engines bound for Egypt. But the North Sea had other plans. As the ships rounded the coast of Friesland, the sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the winds howled with a fury locals would call the breath of the drowned. By dawn, over 200 vessels, cogs, longships, even towering crusader transports lay broken on the shoals or vanished beneath the waves. The disaster didn't just drown men, it drowned an empire's timetable. With half their fleet lost, the Crusade stalled for months, giving Muslim defenders in Damietta precious time to reinforce their walls. What transformed this storm from a setback to a turning point was the scramble for solutions. European navigators, humbled by the sea's indifference to their holy cause, began stealing knowledge from the very people they'd sworn to fight. Arabic astrolabes, once dismissed as heathen tools, suddenly appeared in the hands of Christian pilots. These intricate brass devices, capable of measuring the sun's height even in storm-tossed conditions, offered something European guesswork couldn't: precision. Shipmasters who'd once relied on dead reckoning and the stars now plotted courses with mathematical grids, their maps studded with newfound accuracy. The irony was thick. Crusaders who'd sailed to destroy Islamic power returned home carrying the seeds of its naval superiority. Yet the storm's legacy wasn't just technological, it was cultural. Ports from Lisbon to Bergen became melting pots where Muslim and Christian scholars haggled over charts, their rivalries tempered by shared desperation. A single Venetian captain's log from 1224 records paying a Moorish navigator in gold ducats for the secret of the southern stars. Even the church, initially wary of foreign science, quietly blessed the practice when bishops realized accurate navigation meant more tithes from prosperous trade. The sea, it seemed, had no patience for holy wars, only survival. But while nature's fury could unite enemies, human folly often undid that unity. Just 3 years later, off the coast of Cyprus, a drunken captain's mistake would prove that even the best tools were no match for arrogance. His ship, overloaded with timber and wine, ignored warnings about an approaching squall. The wreckage washed ashore for weeks, each splintered plank a lesson in hubris. The astrolabe in his cabin, still glinting in the sun, showed the coordinates where he'd gone wrong. The sea forgave no one. Dover Harbor in 1228 should have been a picture of prosperity, sails crowding the horizon, bundles of English wool piled high on the docks, ready to feed Flanders' hungry looms. But prosperity had a price: chaos. With no system to manage the incoming ships, captains jostled for space like merchants at a market square. Then came the moment everything went wrong. A wine-laden cog from Gascony, its sails tangled in a sudden gust, veered sharply into a line of moored vessels. The crunch of splintering would set off a chain reaction, hulls slamming into hulls until 50 ships, their precious wool bales soaking up seawater like sponges, sank beneath the harbor's murky surface. By nightfall, the lifeblood of England's economy was drowning in the shallows. What made this disaster more than a local tragedy was its brutal exposure of medieval Europe's growing pains. Ports like Dover weren't just docks anymore. They were choke points in a booming trade network, strained to breaking by ships that grew larger each decade. The wool lost in the collision represented 6 months' wages for an entire village, a blow that sent shockwaves through markets from London to Bruges. But from the wreckage emerged something unexpected: order. Within a year, Dover's harbourmasters implemented the first docking schedules, charging tolls to fund harbour patrols who enforced strict lanes for incoming and outgoing traffic. These weren't just rules, they were the birth of modern port logistics, a system soon copied from Bristol to Genoa. Yet the deeper lesson lay ashore. the disaster revealed how medieval towns, scrambling to profit from maritime trade, had built themselves into traps. Warehouses crowded right up to the water's edge, leaving no room for ships to maneuver. Quaysides extended haphazardly into deeper water, created deadly bottlenecks. In the years after the catastrophe, coastal cities from York to Marseille began demolishing their own waterfronts, carving out wider basins and fire breaks between storage yards. The sea demanded space, and now, finally, they listened. But while Northern Europe grappled with crowded harbors, the Mediterranean was about to witness a naval blunder of epic proportions, one where human arrogance, not poor planning, would doom an entire fleet. Off the coast of Malta, a squadron of Aragonese warships was sailing blindly into a trap. The waters off Maloria Reef had always been treacherous, a maze of sandbars and shifting currents where the Tyrrhenian Sea toyed with unwary sailors. But in the summer of 1284, they became a battlefield. The Genoese admiral Oberto Doria knew the reef's secrets like the lines on his own palms. When the Pisan fleet gave chase, he didn't lead them into open water. He lured them straight into the shallows where the tide was already retreating. Within hours, the pride of Pisa's navy, 40 galleys, their oars still churning futilely, ran aground like beached whales. Genoese archers, perched safely on deeper drafted ships, turned the trapped vessels into floating pyres. By dusk, Pisa's maritime ambitions had burned with them. What made this disaster so catastrophic wasn't just the loss of ships, it was the death of a republic. For 2 centuries, Pisa had been a titan of Mediterranean trade, its merchants rivaling Venice and Genoa. But with its fleet reduced to splinters, the city's wealth evaporated. Banks collapsed, warehouses stood empty. Even the iconic Leaning Tower, then still under construction, stalled for lack of funds. Genoa didn't just win a battle that day, it inherited a monopoly on Western Mediterranean trade, while Venice swooped in to claim Pisa's eastern routes. The balance of Italian power had shifted overnight, all because one admiral understood the tides better than his enemies. Yet the true legacy of Maloria lay in its tactics. For the first time, a naval victory wasn't won by brute force or sheer numbers, but by exploiting the sea itself as a weapon. Within decades, every maritime power from Barcelona to Constantinople was training pilots in coastal hydrography, the art of reading currents, tides, and hidden sandbars. Ship designs evolved too, with shallow drafted galleys giving way to deeper hulled vessels that couldn't be lured into traps. The age of blindly chasing an enemy was over. The age of naval chess had begun. But while humans learned to weaponize the sea, nature needed no such strategy. Just 4 years later, a tempest in the Bay of Biscay would prove that even the cleverest admiral was no match for the ocean's raw fury. A Castilian armada, laden with silver and wool, vanished without a trace, taking with it the economic hopes of a kingdom. The sea taught its lessons in blood and gold, and no one, not even the victors of Maloria, could claim to master it. The harbor of Messina in 1347 was a portrait of bustling normality, sailors hauling crates of Crimean grain, merchants haggling over silks from the east, children darting between the legs of dockworkers. No one noticed the stowaways, hidden in the straw bedding and grain sacks. Black rats scrambled ashore, their flea-infested fur carrying a microscopic killer. Within days, the first dockworker collapsed with swollen lymph nodes and blackened skin. Within weeks, the city became a charnel house. The ships that brought silks and spices had delivered something far deadlier: the Black Death, a biological storm that would sweep across Europe and rewrite the rules of maritime trade forever. What made this disaster unlike any other was its invisibility. Storms shattered ships, pirates stole cargo, but plague traveled silently, hitching rides on the very vessels that fed and clothed medieval Europe. The numbers still stagger: 25 million dead, whole villages emptied, fields left untilled. Yet from this devastation emerged two radical shifts. First, the desperate scramble for quarantine. Venice, watching Messina's horror unfold, became the first to enforce the Trentino, 30 days of isolation for incoming crews. Soon, ports from Marseille to Constantinople built lazarettos, specialized quarantine islands where ships aired out their cargo while sailors waited under armed guard. These weren't just protocols, they were the birth of public health policy, with maritime trade as its reluctant testing ground. But the plague's second legacy lay below decks. Shipwrights, once focused solely on speed and cargo space, began redesigning holds to deter rodents. Straw bedding gave way to cedar chips, which fleas avoided. Grain storage shifted to raised platforms with metal legs too slippery for rats to climb. Even the humble ship's cat, once a mouser of little note, became a prized crew member, their wages sometimes paid in fish and cream. The sea had taught a brutal lesson: connectivity came with consequences. Yet as Europe's population slowly recovered, a new danger emerged, not from rats but from human greed. With so many dead, surviving sailors could demand higher wages, tempting captains to cut corners elsewhere. Overloaded ships, now crewed by inexperienced hands, began vanishing at alarming rates. The sea, it seemed, would always find fresh ways to remind humanity of its power. And in the Baltic, a different kind of reckoning was brewing, one where ice, not disease, would prove the deadliest foe. The Baltic winter of 1362 arrived like a thief, silent, sudden, and utterly without mercy. One evening, the Hanseatic fleet lay at anchor off Gotland, their holds groaning with Russian furs and Prussian grain. By dawn, the sea had turned to iron. Temperatures plunged so fast that sailors woke to find their ships encased in ice, the rigging glittering with grotesque beauty. As weeks dragged into months, the crews faced an impossible choice: stay aboard and starve, or abandon their vessels to the elements. Most chose life, trudging across the frozen waves toward distant smoke from coastal villages. When spring finally came, it brought not relief but destruction. The thawing ice didn't release the ships, it ground them to splinters, their hulls popping like wine barrels under the pressure. 60 cogs, the backbone of Northern Europe's trade, became a jigsaw of wreckage scattered across the seafloor. What made this disaster so transformative wasn't just the scale of loss, it was the hubris it exposed. For generations, Hanseatic merchants had dismissed winter sailing as a fool's errand, relying on fair weather routes between April and October. But as demand for Baltic goods soared, captains pushed deeper into autumn, gambling that no storm could outmatch their sturdy cogs. The ice proved them catastrophically wrong, yet from this failure emerged two revolutions. Shipwrights in Lubeck began experimenting with double-planked hulls, the outer layer sheathed in tar-soaked horsehair to repel ice. More radical still was the network of Winterhafen ports specifically fortified to shelter fleets during cold months, their harbors dredged deep to prevent freezing. These weren't just docks, they were lifelines turning seasonal trade into a year-round enterprise. But the ice hid a darker lesson. As salvagers picked through the wreckage that spring, they noticed something odd: barrels of Rhenish wine, perfectly preserved in the frigid water, their contents now more valuable than the ships that carried them. Suddenly, every merchant in the Baltic wondered, what if winter wasn't just a hazard but an opportunity? Within a decade, a new breed of ice captains emerged, men who charted the flows like land-bound explorers mapping mountain passes. Their secret, hiring Finnish pilots whose ancestors had navigated frozen seas for centuries. The Hanseatic League, once rigidly German in its ways, had been humbled into cultural borrowing and profited handsomely for it. Yet even as Northern Europe adapted, the disaster exposed a flaw no hull could reinforce: human greed. The fleet lost in 1362 had been overloaded, its captains lured by bonus payments for late-season deliveries. When the Thaw revealed their cargo manifests, the numbers told a damning story. Some ships carried 30% beyond safe capacity. The ice didn't cause the tragedy, it merely finished what recklessness had begun. And so the Baltic's frozen graveyard became a cautionary tale whispered in every counting house from London to Novgorod. But far to the south, another invisible killer was stalking the waves, one no reinforced hull could withstand. In the Strait of Gibraltar, ships began vanishing not to ice or storms, but to something far more insidious: the silent theft of the sea itself. The Strait of Gibraltar had always been a place of superstition, where the Mediterranean's blue calm met the Atlantic's restless swell, and sailors whispered of unseen forces lurking beneath the waves. But in the autumn of 1407, those whispers became screams. A Portuguese convoy of 12 caravels, their sails fat with North African gold and ivory, entered the strait under clear skies. Then, without warning, the sea itself seemed to rebel. A current no one had charted, swift as a galloping horse, wrenched the ships sideways, dragging them onto the razor-sharp rocks of Tarifa's coast. By nightfall, hundreds of sailors had vanished beneath the foam, their cries drowned out by the crash of timbers. Locals would later call it the Mare do Diabo, the Devil's Tide, a current that appeared without warning and left only wreckage in its wake. For Prince Henry of Portugal, news of the disaster struck like a thunderclap. Here was a force that defied all known maritime logic, a current that didn't follow the moon's pull or the wind's direction. Instead of dismissing it as bad luck, Henry saw something far more unsettling: a gap in human knowledge wide enough to swallow entire fleets. Within months, his palace at Sagres became a hive of cartographers, Arab navigators, and even Jewish astronomers, all piecing together the first systematic maps of ocean currents. These weren't just charts, they were lifelines plotting the invisible rivers within the sea itself. Sailors learned to read the subtle signs, the way certain waters shimmered with a peculiar slickness, or how seabirds clustered where two currents clashed. By 1420, Portuguese ships carried roteiros, detailed sailing instructions that transformed guesswork into science. Yet the Devil's Tide's true legacy lay beyond navigation. Henry's obsession with currents led him to a radical theory: if one unseen force could wreck ships, might others aid them? His pilots began experimenting with the Canary Current, a westward flow that seemed to point like an arrow toward uncharted seas. This wasn't just about avoiding disaster, it was about harnessing the ocean's hidden highways. The caravels that later rounded Africa and reached India didn't just sail on the sea, they rode its secret pathways, turning a killer's trick into an explorer's tool. But while Portugal turned tragedy into triumph, the Indian Ocean was brewing a catastrophe of its own. In the bustling port of Calicut, a fleet of Chinese treasure ships lay at anchor, unaware that their voyage would end not in storm or battle, but in flames fueled by politics and pride. The sea's lessons were universal, but its punishments took many forms. The lanterns of Zheng He's treasure ships should have been a beacon of Ming power, floating palaces of silk and spice, their hulls heavy with tribute from a dozen kingdoms. But on that suffocating night off Sumatra in 1424, the glow came not from celebration, but from mutiny. 3 ships burned like paper lanterns, their priceless cargo of porcelain and peppercorns swallowed by flames. The cause, a crew pushed beyond human limits, their grievances ignored by eunuch admirals more concerned with imperial prestige than survival. When the smoke cleared, the message reached Beijing like a thunderclap. The sea, once conquered, had become a liability. This wasn't just a revolt, it was the unraveling of a maritime empire. For decades, the Ming treasure fleets had been the wonder of the known world, their sheer scale dwarfing anything Europe could muster. A single voyage might carry 27,000 men, diplomats, sailors, even imperial astrologers across the Indian Ocean. But the mutiny exposed the fragile reality beneath the spectacle. Maintaining these floating cities drained the treasury, while Confucian scholars at court whispered that the voyages brought back nothing but strange animals and empty gestures. Worse, the burned ships had been carrying tribute meant for the Yongle Emperor's tomb, a sacrilege that hardened the new ruler's heart against the sea. Within months, the greatest fleet in history was ordered dismantled, its shipyards silenced, its charts locked away. The consequences would ripple far beyond China's shores. With the Ming withdrawal, the Indian Ocean became a power vacuum. Arab and Indian merchants, long accustomed to Ming protection against pirates, found themselves exposed. Ports from Malacca to Mogadishu, once thriving hubs under China's umbrella, now scrambled for new alliances. Into this void sailed the Portuguese, not with hundreds of ships, but with a handful of caravels armed with something far more dangerous: ambition. Vasco da Gama's arrival in Calicut just 75 years later wasn't just exploration, it was colonization by default. The Ming had left the door unguarded, and Europe walked right in. Yet the mutiny's deepest lesson lay in its timing. While China turned inward, Europe was learning the opposite lesson the hard way. That same year, a storm in the Bay of Biscay annihilated a Castilian salt convoy, drowning 200 sailors. But where the Ming saw failure as reason to retreat, the Spanish saw it as a challenge to innovate. Shipwrights in Bilbao began experimenting with reinforced hulls, while navigators pored over Arab astrolabes salvaged from wrecks. The sea punished all equally, but only some heeded its warnings. What made the Ming retreat so pivotal was its unintended gift to Europe: time. Without China's colossal fleet patrolling the Indian Ocean, Portuguese and Dutch merchants faced no rival capable of matching their firepower. The spice trade, once a delicate network of Asian intermediaries, became a European monopoly almost by accident. Even the mutineers who burned those ships couldn't have imagined their rebellion would echo across centuries, tilting the balance of global power toward the West. But the oceans have a way of humbling even the proudest empires. As European ships grew bolder, they too would face their own mutinies, storms, and reckonings, proof that no nation, no matter how ambitious, could ever truly tame the sea. The autumn of 1449 should have been a season of celebration along England's southern coast. A fleet of 30 merchant ships heavy with casks of Bordeaux's finest claret, their arrival promising banquets and brimming coffers. But the Channel had other plans. A gale, swift and brutal as a thief in the night, caught the convoy off the Isle of Wight. By dawn, not a single ship remained afloat. Barrels of wine worth a king's ransom bobbed among the wreckage, their precious contents staining the waves crimson. The disaster didn't just drown a vintage, it drowned an entire economic model. What made this wreck more than a tempest's whim was its timing. England's nobility had built their fortunes on French wine, trading wool for claret in a cycle as predictable as the tides. But with the fleet gone, prices quadrupled overnight. Taverns from London to York stood empty, their patrons staring at bare shelves. The shockwaves reached far beyond thirsty courtiers. Merchants who'd borrowed against future shipments faced ruin, their ledgers bleeding red ink. In desperation, brewers seized the moment. Hops, once a niche crop in Flanders, suddenly sprouted across English fields. Alewives perfected recipes for a darker, stronger drink that could weather storms both literal and economic. Within a decade, beer wasn't just a substitute, it was a cultural force, its bitter tang woven into the fabric of daily life. Yet the true lesson of the wine fleet lay in its revelation of fragility. Medieval trade wasn't just about goods, it was about trust, about networks so finely balanced that a single storm could snap them. When Bordeaux's vineyards lost their English buyers, entire regions of France withered. Vineyards were uprooted, their land given over to grain. The sea had done what centuries of war couldn't. It broke the back of the wine trade. But as brewers toasted their newfound fortunes, the ocean was preparing an even crueler blow. Just 3 years later, a different kind of disaster would strike, one where human error, not nature's fury, would doom a fleet. Off the coast of Brittany, a squadron of Hanseatic cogs, their holds stuffed with Baltic grain, would ignore a pilot's warning and sail straight into a trap of their own, making the fall of Constantinople in 1453 sent shockwaves through Europe, but nowhere did the tremors hit harder than Venice. The most serene republic had built its fortune on two pillars, trade and salt. For centuries, Venetian merchants controlled the flow of this white gold from Crimean salt pans to European kitchens. Then came that fateful autumn convoy, 30 galleys, their holds packed with crystalline wealth, caught in a storm so violent it scattered them like leaves across the Black Sea. When the survivors stumbled into port with empty hands, Venice didn't just lose ships, it lost its grip on an empire's appetite. What transformed this disaster from a ledger entry into a historical pivot was salt's invisible ubiquity. Without it, meat rotted in days, cheeses failed to cure, and armies couldn't march on spoiled rations. Prices in Florence and Paris quintupled overnight. Butchers stared at mountains of unsellable carcasses, while fishermen watched their daily catches turn to sludge in the summer heat. Desperation bred innovation. In the alpine valleys of Tyrol, where salt had always been scarce, housewives had long smoked meats over juniper branches to preserve them. Now their techniques spread like wildfire. Soon, every coastal town from Brittany to Dalmatia bristled with smokehouses, their chimneys puffing like steamships. The humble herring, once salted by the barrel, now hung golden brown over alderwood fires, a flavor that would define northern European cuisine for generations. Yet the culinary revolution hid a darker truth. Venice's loss wasn't just about salt, it was about trust. For 200 years, the Republic's fleets had been the clockwork that kept Europe's pantry stocked. Their collapse exposed the fragility of centralized systems in an age of storms and shifting power. German merchants in Lübeck seized the moment, organizing their own salt runs to Iceland's geothermal pans. Basque whalers, realizing brine wasn't the only way to preserve food, began packing their catches in whale oil, a practice that would later fuel the age of exploration. The sea had broken one monopoly, only to create a dozen new competitors. But the sinking of that fleet carried another, more poignant loss. Among the wreckage lay crates of Crimean saffron, Armenian cochineal, and Persian rosewater, luxuries the Venetians had tucked between salt sacks as profitable extras. Their disappearance didn't just dull Europe's palate, it severed a delicate web of cultural exchange. The vibrant stews of Spain grew plainer without saffron's golden hue. Italian painters, suddenly deprived of crimson dyes, turned to cheaper earth pigments, altering the palette of Renaissance art itself. Even perfumers in Grasse struggled to replicate the musky depth of Crimean rose oil. Perhaps the cruelest irony lay in the timing. That same year, Portuguese caravels were rounding Africa's Cape of Good Hope, opening sea routes to spices that bypassed Venetian middlemen entirely. The Republic's maritime misfortune had unwittingly accelerated its own obsolescence. Salt had been the foundation of their power, but the ocean, as always, had the final word, washing away empires as easily as it erased footprints in the sand. Yet, even as Venice licked its wounds, another disaster was brewing where the Baltic meets the North Sea, one that would prove storms weren't the only force capable of rewriting history. Off the coast of Gotland, a fleet laden with Swedish iron ore was about to meet a fate so bizarre, it would challenge everything sailors thought they knew about the sea's treachery. The amber trade was the lifeblood of medieval Prussia, its golden nuggets more precious than silver, its guilds richer than kings. So when the Mermen set sail from Königsberg in 1464, her holds packed with a year's harvest of Baltic amber, the entire city held its breath. The ship's disappearance wasn't just a mystery, it was an economic earthquake. No storm warnings, no wreckage, not even a single barrel bobbing in the waves. The Merman and her priceless cargo had simply ceased to exist. What made this vanishing act so catastrophic was the domino effect it triggered. Amber wasn't just jewelry, it was currency, medicine, even spiritual armor, ground into powders for ailments, carved into rosaries to ward off plague. With the guild's coffers emptied overnight, artisans from Bruges to Byzantium found their workshops silent. But desperation bred innovation. Within months, the Teutonic Knights, who controlled Prussia's amber monopoly, unveiled the ledger, a ledger so detailed it recorded every lump of amber by weight, color, and even the fishermen who'd netted it. These weren't just inventory lists, they were the blueprints of modern insurance. Merchants now paid a fee based on cargo value, pooling risk like never before. The system was so effective that Lloyd's of London would later copy it verbatim. Yet the Merman's ghost haunted more than ledgers. Her disappearance exposed a flaw in the era's proudest technology, the compass. Investigators piecing together her final route made a chilling discovery. The ship's pilot, convinced his needle pointed true, had likely sailed straight into a zone where magnetic north skewed wildly, a phenomenon locals called the Devil's Dance. Suddenly, every captain who'd mocked astronomers for their star charts grew quiet. Navigators began carrying two compasses, comparing their readings against the sun's position. The sea, it seemed, had weaponized science itself, but the cruelest twist lay in the wreck's eventual discovery 4 centuries later. Divers found the Merman's bones off Gotland, her amber still nestled in the holds. The ship hadn't been stolen or sunk by waves. She'd struck a blueberg, a nearly invisible chunk of glacial ice that had drifted south undetected. The disaster that birthed modern maritime law had been caused by nature's subtlest assassin, water, frozen silent and clear as glass. Just as Europe absorbed this lesson, another ship was preparing to sail, one that would prove even the best laws couldn't outrun human greed. In Lisbon, a caravel named the São João was being overloaded with spices, her captain ignoring every new regulation. The sea's next classroom would be the Cape of Good Hope, and the tuition would be paid in blood. The Lisbon docks buzzed with excitement in the spring of 1472, all eyes fixed on the Santa Catarina, a carack so massive her shadow dwarfed the fishing boats bobbing beside her. 3 towering masts, hull planked with Brazilian hardwood, and most revolutionary of all, 2 full decks of iron cannons mounted high above the waterline. She wasn't just a ship, she was a floating fortress, Portugal's answer to pirates and rival kingdoms. But the sea cares nothing for human pride. On her maiden voyage, a gust of wind caught her broadside, the weight of those elevated guns tipping her like a child's toy. Within minutes, the Santa Catarina rolled onto her beam ends, her splendid sails swallowing seawater as she dragged 600 souls into the depths. What made this failure so pivotal wasn't the loss of life tragic as it was, but the shockwave it sent through naval architecture. For decades, shipwrights had stacked weapons higher, believing elevation meant advantage. The Santa Catarina's wreckage proved the opposite. Stability mattered more than firepower. In the frantic months that followed, a quiet revolution unfolded in shipyards from Barcelona to Bristol. Cannons migrated downward, nestled just above the waterline where their weight anchored the hull instead of unbalancing it. Hulls grew wider, their curves subtle but calculated to distribute mass. The result, a new breed of warship, the galleon, with a profile as sleek as a hunting hound and firepower that could level cities without capsizing. Yet the disaster's true legacy lay in its unintended diplomacy. Portuguese spies sent to investigate rival designs after the sinking returned with sketches of Venetian merchant ships, vessels built for cargo, not combat, but with hull ratios that defied capsizing. Shipwrights, once secretive about their craft, began trading notes across borders. The Santa Catarina's grave became a classroom where former enemies shared blueprints, her failure forging an unspoken alliance of pragmatism. By 1480, a Spanish galleon and an English carrack could exchange broadsides, knowing both owed their survival to the same sunken teacher. But the sea reserves its cruelest lessons for those who ignore history. Just 5 years later, a French admiral eager to outdo the galleon ordered his own super carrack built with 3 gun decks. The Mont Saint Mitchell lasted 8 hours before listing fatally in calm seas, her designers having missed the Santa Catarina's central lesson: innovation without understanding is just expensive suicide. The ocean forgives no arrogance, but to the humble it offers gifts like the galleon's graceful silhouette, born from a wreck's bitter wisdom. As Europe's navies adapted, however, a new threat emerged where no cannon could reach. Off the Azores, ships began vanishing not to poor design, but to something far more insidious: the silent, creeping rot of shipworm, tunneling through hulls like termites through parchment. The age of wooden giants was ending, and the sea, ever the patient professor, was preparing its next harsh lesson. The coast of Galicia was supposed to be safe that night, a well-charted stretch of the Camino de Santiago's pilgrim route, its waters dotted with fishing boats and merchant cogs. But in the autumn of 1489, the sea played a cruel joke. 20 Spanish ships, their sails fat with wool and Flemish tapestries, followed a beacon's golden flicker toward what they thought was the port of Coruña. Instead, the light led them straight onto the teeth of the devil, a jagged reef that lived up to its name. By dawn, the shoreline was littered with splintered hulls and sodden tapestries, while just beyond the rocks, a lone figure watched from a stolen fishing boat. The lighthouse had been nothing more than a bonfire in a tower ruin, and its architect, a disgraced Castilian duke turned pirate, his family crest still visible on the dagger left impaled in a drowned captain's chart. This wasn't just piracy, it was psychological warfare. The rogue noble, known only as El Faro for his signature trick, had exploited a gap in medieval navigation no one realized existed. Ships relied on coastal fires for guidance, assuming any light marked a friendly harbor. His deception exposed a terrifying truth: the sea's greatest dangers weren't storms or reefs, but human ingenuity weaponized against trust. The shockwaves reached far beyond Spain. Within months, Portugal's King John II ordered the construction of the Tower of Belém, its stone walls thick enough to deter saboteurs, its lanterns fueled by oil instead of wood to prevent imitation. Venice standardized its lagoon beacons with unique glass lenses that cast distinct patterns. Early maritime QR codes. Even the Hanseatic League, no stranger to cutthroat tactics, banned bonfires within 5 miles of trade routes. The pirates' trap had backfired spectacularly, birthing the modern lighthouse system. Yet the cruelest twist lay in El Faro's fate. After evading capture for years, he attempted one last trick near Cadiz, only to discover the hard way that reefs shift with the tides. His own false beacon lured him onto rocks he'd sworn were safe, a poetic end that sailors still whisper about. But the sea wasn't done teaching. That same winter, a storm surge flooded Corunna's brand new lighthouse, extinguishing its flame for 3 critical nights. The lesson was clear. No matter how clever humans became, nature always held the final card. And just as coastal nations celebrated their newfound security, an entirely different threat was rising from the depths, one no lighthouse could warn against. In the Baltic, fishermen began hauling up nets full of dead fish, their gills clogged with a strange black sludge. The sea, it seemed, had invented pollution centuries before industry did. The year 1491 dawned with an eerie silence across Europe's harbors. No creak of ropes, no snap of canvas, just the lap of water against idle hulls. For the first time in living memory, the winds had simply stopped. Week after week, ships bound for Bruges, Venice, and Lisbon languished in port, their captains staring at limp flags and glassy seas. The Atlantic became a mirror, the Mediterranean a bathtub. By autumn, markets from London to Constantinople stood empty. No Baltic grain, no Spanish wool, no Egyptian spices. The crisis had no name until a Florentine merchant scrawled in his ledger, "L'anno senza navi," the year without ships. What made this disaster so insidious was its silence. Storms sank vessels, pirates stole cargo, but stillness, it starved empires by inches. Bakers ground last season's moldy grain into bitter loaves. Armorers ran out of Baltic iron, leaving knights to fight in patched mail. Even the church felt the pinch. Candles for mass dwindled without Baltic beeswax. Yet from this paralysis emerged one of history's great ironies. The same calm that strangled trade also gave sailors time to rethink their tools. Dockyards from Genoa to Bristol buzzed with experiments as shipwrights adapted the lateen sail, a triangular design Arab traders had used for centuries. Unlike square sails that relied on brute wind force, lateens could catch whispers of breeze, even pivot against the wind like a fish changing direction. Within months, hybrids emerged, cogs with lateen-rigged masts, carracks with mixed sails. The sea's silence had forced Europe to listen and borrow, but the stillness hid a darker lesson about connectivity. As prices soared, riots erupted in Flanders where weavers couldn't get English wool. In Venice, the Doge imposed bread rationing while warehouses burst with unsold silks. No ships meant no exports either. The crisis revealed how deeply medieval economies depended not just on goods moving, but on them moving constantly. A single broken link, those missing winds, could unravel the whole chain. Meanwhile, on the Iberian Peninsula, the disaster fueled a dangerous gamble. If the winds refused to come to Europe, perhaps Europe could find new winds elsewhere. Christopher Columbus, his own departure stalled by the calm, scribbled frantic notes about westerly trade winds rumored to blow steady across the Atlantic. The year without ships didn't just change sails, it redirected ambitions. By the time the winds finally returned, the race to the New World had shifted from fantasy to inevitability. And when those first caravels finally caught the restored breezes in 1492, they carried more than just lateen sails. They carried the lingering fear of another silent year and the determination to never be trapped again. Yet even as Europe adapted, nature prepared another reminder of its power. Far to the north, Icelandic fishermen began noticing something odd. Their waters were growing warmer, their cod vanishing into the depths. The ocean's moods were shifting, and the next disaster wouldn't be stillness, it would be a tempest so vast, it would redefine the word storm. The Nina's timbers groaned like a living thing as the storm's fury mounted, her sails shredded to ribbons and her decks awash with frothing seawater. Christopher Columbus clung to the helm, his journal tucked desperately inside his oilskin coat, the only record of a continent Europe didn't yet know existed. This wasn't just a squall, it was a cosmic irony. After surviving the uncharted horrors of the Atlantic crossing, after proving the naysayers wrong, the Admiral of the Ocean Sea now faced annihilation on the homeward stretch. One rogue wave, one snapped mast, and the New World might have vanished back into legend. What made this near disaster so pivotal wasn't just the risk to Columbus, it was the fragility of an entire historical pivot point. Consider the cargo aboard that battered caravel. No gold or spices, but something far more precious: maps, crude sketches of Caribbean coastlines, logs noting indigenous trade goods, even samples of strange plants tucked into wax-sealed barrels. Had the Nina gone down, Spain would have had only the vaguest rumors from Columbus's earlier stop in Portugal, where he'd hastily scribbled letters to the crown before the storm hit. The race to colonize might have stalled for years, leaving the door open for Portugal or even England to claim the prize. Instead, the Nina limped into Lisbon's harbor on March 4, 1493, her hull leaking but her secrets intact. The storm's aftermath sparked a logistical revolution. Ferdinand and Isabella, shaken by how close they'd come to losing their investment, ordered the immediate establishment of the Carrera de Indias, a systematic convoy system where heavily armed galleons traveled in packs, timed to avoid hurricane seasons. These weren't just ships, they were floating archives, each carrying duplicate logs stored in lead-lined chests. Spain had learned the hard way that knowledge was the real treasure, and they would safeguard it with military precision. Yet the Atlantic had one more lesson to teach. That same year, a second storm scattered Columbus's 17-ship follow-up expedition, sending 6 vessels irrevocably off course. One, the San Juan, eventually washed up in Ireland with delirious sailors babbling about lands of endless green. The incident sparked whispers in Bristol's taverns, whispers that would later inspire John Cabot's voyage under the English flag. The ocean's chaos didn't just threaten empires, it scattered clues like breadcrumbs, ensuring no single nation could monopolize its secrets for long. But while Spain celebrated its hard-won knowledge, another maritime disaster was brewing, one that would prove even the best routes couldn't outrun human error. Off the Azores, a Portuguese spice fleet, its hulls swollen with pepper and cinnamon, was about to make a navigational mistake that would rewrite the rules of celestial navigation forever. The Bristol Cod fleet left port in the spring of 1499 with high hopes, 20 stout ships crewed by men who knew the North Atlantic's moods. Their destination, the teeming fishing grounds near Newfoundland, where Basque and Portuguese sailors whispered of cod so thick they slowed passing ships. But when winter came early that year, sealing the Labrador coast in ice thicker than castle walls, the fleet never returned. No wreckage washed ashore, no survivors staggered into trading posts, just silence, and the creeping realization that the sea had swallowed them whole. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. English fishermen had clung to their traditional single-masted vessels, trusting familiar designs over foreign innovations. But the Basques, who'd fished these waters for generations, used something different: sturdy, high-sided whaling ships with reinforced hulls to withstand ice flows. After the disaster, Bristol's shipwrights swallowed their pride and copied every detail, from the Basque ships' curved stems to their extra-thick oak planking. Within a decade, these hybrid vessels dominated the Newfoundland run, their holds bursting with salt-cured cod that fed Europe's growing population. The Lost Fleet's legacy wasn't just grief, it was the birth of England's North Atlantic supremacy. Yet even as northern waters rewarded adaptation, the Mediterranean clung to its old perils. Venetian galleys, sleek and fast but dangerously low to the water, still raced between Alexandria and Marseille, their captains dismissing the northerners' bulky designs as clumsy overkill. Then, in 1504, a summer squall near Crete capsized an entire grain convoy in minutes, drowning 600 sailors and leaving Venice hungry. The lesson was clear: no sea, no matter how familiar, tolerated complacency. The contrast between these two disasters, one spurring innovation, the other ignored, revealed a deeper truth about maritime survival. The ocean didn't care about tradition or regional pride. It rewarded those who listened, whether to Basque shipwrights or the creak of overstrained timbers. And as European ambitions stretched across the globe, this lesson would echo far beyond fishing grounds, reshaping empires, one hull at a time. But while shipwrights debated designs, another threat was brewing where no vessel could sail. In the Baltic, a silent killer crept through the waves, its poison invisible until nets hauled up fish bloated with strange black growths. The sea's next lesson wouldn't be about ice or storms, but something far more insidious: the slow, creeping cost of human industry. The Venetian harbor of Modon should have been bustling with activity: that morning sailors loading crates of Ottoman silks, merchants haggling over the price of Cypriot wine, carpenters hammering fresh planks into a new galley's hull. But history often turns on moments no one sees coming. A lone spark, perhaps from a blacksmith's forge or a careless lantern, flickered onto the deck of the Venice, a munitions ship crammed with 3,000 barrels of gunpowder. The explosion that followed wasn't just loud, it was apocalyptic. A fireball erupted skyward, shattering windows in buildings half a mile away. When the smoke cleared, the Venice had vanished entirely, along with 200 souls and 6 nearby vessels caught in the blast. The sea itself seemed to boil, littered with charred timbers and the ghastly flotsam of war. This wasn't merely an accident, it was a wake-up call that reverberated across naval history. Before Modon, gunpowder was treated like any other cargo, stacked haphazardly in holds alongside food, ropes, and even lanterns. The disaster exposed a flaw so obvious it was criminal no one had addressed it sooner. Centralized powder storage was a floating death sentence. Within months, Venetian shipwrights pioneered a radical redesign. Powder rooms were relocated to the lowest decks, insulated with layers of wet sand and brick, and accessible only through narrow, iron-reinforced corridors. Even more crucially, these chambers were sealed off from all potential ignition sources: no candles, no forges, not even iron nails that might strike sparks. The concept spread like wildfire, ironically, to every maritime power from Spain to the Ottoman Empire. Modern battleships still follow these principles, their ammunition elevators and blast doors direct descendants of Modon's hard-won wisdom. Yet the tragedy's deepest lesson wasn't technical, it was human. Among the dead were 30 boys under 12, powder monkeys who'd been paid pennies to ferry charges between decks. Their deaths sparked the first recorded protests over child labor in naval warfare, with Venetian mothers barricading docks to prevent their sons from being pressed into service. While the practice wouldn't end overnight, the outcry planted seeds of reform. By the 1530s, Spanish naval codes explicitly banned children from powder handling, a small mercy born from unimaginable loss. The sea has a cruel way of teaching vigilance. Just 5 years after Modon, a nearly identical explosion obliterated a Portuguese carrack off Goa, proof that lessons unlearned are destined to be repeated. But this time, the Venice's legacy held. The blast was contained to a single compartment, saving the ship and most of its crew. Sometimes progress is measured not in victories, but in disasters averted. and in the quiet, uncelebrated safety protocols that keep sailors from becoming footnotes in history's deadliest mistakes. As Europe's navies adapted, however, another invisible threat was already seeping into their hulls, not from sparks or storms, but from the very timber that kept them afloat. In the shipyards of Brittany, workers began noticing strange tunnels worming through oak planks, as if the wood itself were rotting from within. The age of shipworms had arrived, and their appetite would sink more ships than any admiral dared admit. The moonless night off the coast of São Tomé in 1503 should have been silent, just the creak of the Portuguese slave ship São João's timbers and the whisper of waves against her hull. But the darkness hid a rebellion. Enslaved men from the Congo, their wrists raw from chains, had spent weeks loosening a single iron bar below decks. When their moment came, they struck like a storm surge, overwhelming the crew with sheer desperation. The ship was theirs, but freedom was still miles away. With no navigational knowledge and the Coast Guard in pursuit, their hard-won victory turned to horror as the São João ran aground on a reef, its hull splitting like ripe fruit. By dawn, the waves had claimed both the enslaved and their captors, leaving only splintered wood and a moral quandary that would ripple through Europe's courts and churches. This wasn't just another shipwreck, it was a spark in the tinderbox of medieval conscience. Eyewitness accounts from nearby fishermen, later recorded by a Dominican friar, described the rebels' cries not as terror but defiance, echoing across the water until the sea swallowed them whole. The story spread through Lisbon's docks like wildfire, reaching the ears of King Manuel's court. For the first time, the slave trade's apologists faced an uncomfortable question. If the enslaved would rather die free than live in chains, could the practice truly be called civilizing? The Church, long complicit in sanctioning slavery as a means of conversion, found itself split. Some priests pointed to the revolt as divine judgment, while merchants argued it proved the need for tighter security, not abolition. The sea had delivered no answers, only a mirror forcing Europe to confront its own hypocrisy. Yet beneath the moral debates lay a quieter revolution in ship design. The São João's fatal flaw wasn't just its human cargo. It was the new castle structure towering over its stern, a design meant to intimidate pirates and repel boarders. But the height made the ship dangerously unstable, a fact ignored until that moonlit night when panicked rebels and crew alike discovered how easily it capsized in shallow waters. Shipwrights in Lagos, dissecting the wreckage, began sketching lower, sleeker profiles for slave ships, not out of humanity, but cold economics. Dead captives couldn't be sold. The tragedy birthed the infamous tight-pack designs of the transatlantic trade, where efficiency trumped empathy, and the sea's lessons were twisted to serve greed. Meanwhile, the reefs of São Tomé gained a grim new nickname among sailors, as Almas the Souls. Fishermen avoided the area, claiming they could still hear whispers in the waves. Whether ghost story or guilt, the legend endured, a haunting counterpoint to the ledger entries and legal justifications. The ocean had borne witness, and its judgment, though silent, weighed heavier than any chain. But even as one horror faded, another was taking shape on the horizon. In the shipyards of Seville, a new generation of vessels was being fitted with iron shackles bolted directly to the hulls, a technological improvement that ignored the real lesson of the São João. The sea had shown its hand, but humanity, it seemed, was determined to test its patience again. And in the icy waters of the Baltic, an entirely different kind of reckoning was brewing, where nature itself would turn the tables on hubris, this time with a weapon no ship could outrun: ice. The morning of August 12, 1511, dawned clear over the Bay of Biscay, perfect weather for gunnery drills aboard the Spanish carrack Santa Ana. Her crew had no reason to fear the bronze monster they called El Abulo, the grandfather, a cannon so massive it took 8 men to load. Then came the deafening crack, not of fired shot but of splitting metal. A flaw in the casting, invisible to the eye, gave way under pressure. The explosion tore through the starboard hull like parchment, sending Santa Ana to the bottom before her crew could lower a single lifeboat. What sank that day wasn't just a ship, it was the medieval assumption that bigger always meant better. This disaster exposed a terrifying truth. Europe's arms race had outpaced its craftsmanship. Foundries, desperate to meet demand for ever larger guns, had skipped crucial steps in the casting process. Cooling times were cut short, quality checks rushed. The result, bronze cannons riddled with hidden bubbles and fissures, ticking time bombs in the hands of unsuspecting crews. But the Santa Ana's loss sparked something unprecedented: state-mandated testing. Within months, Spanish foundries were required to fire every new cannon twice once with a double charge before it could be mounted on a ship. Gunners marked each successful test with a chiseled cross, giving rise to the term proofing that survives in firearms testing today. The sea had demanded accountability, and for once, humanity listened. Yet the deeper tragedy lay in the pattern it revealed. For every cannon that failed from poor casting, another failed from human folly. Records from the era tell of gunners overloading barrels to impress admirals, of captains ordering broadsides in high seas despite protests from their crews. The Santa Ana's explosion wasn't an isolated incident, it was the climax of a reckless era where ambition outran wisdom. Venetian archives from that same year describe a galley captain who lost half his men because he stored gunpowder next to the cook's fire, dismissing warnings with a laugh. Perhaps the cruelest irony came decades later when salvagers found El Abulo intact on the seafloor, its barrel split open like a banana peel. The cannon hadn't been too weak, it had been too strong. The thickness meant to contain its power instead made it brittle, a lesson metallurgists would spend centuries unraveling. The seafloor became a graveyard of such mistakes, each wreck a textbook for those willing to study it. But even as navies tightened their safety protocols, another threat loomed, one no amount of testing could predict. In the arsenals of Constantinople, Ottoman engineers were experimenting with guns so massive they defied existing foundry techniques. The arms race had only begun, and the ocean's next lesson would be written not in bronze but in iron, and the blood of those who underestimated it. The wine flowed too freely aboard the Dauphine that night in 1524, a celebration of clear skies and fair winds after weeks battling Atlantic storms. No one thought to stop the ship's pilot, a grizzled Breton named Yves Leclerc, as he drained cup after cup, boasting of navigating these waters blindfolded. By dawn, his bleary eyes mistook the shifting dunes of Cape Fear for the familiar cliffs of Hispaniola. The crash was deafening. Timbers splintered like kindling as the ship ran aground, her hull skewered on a sandbar no chart had recorded. The crew, half-drowned and furious, watched their cargo of Lyon silk and Rowan lace dissolve into the surf, along with Leclerc's reputation. This wasn't just another shipwreck. It was a scandal that reached the ears of King Francis himself, who demanded answers with the same fury he'd once reserved for Habsburg spies. How could a single man's folly doom an entire expedition? The solution emerged from an unlikely place, the courtroom. During Leclerc's trial, prosecutors produced a tattered notebook, the pilot's personal routier, filled with hastily scribbled bearings and landmarks. Though useless in his drunken state, those notes became damning evidence. Suddenly, every captain in France saw the value in meticulous record-keeping. Within months, naval regulations required 2 logbooks, one for the captain, one for the pilot, their entries cross-checked daily like monks verifying scripture. The sea had birthed bureaucracy, yet the disaster's true legacy lay in its collision of old and new. Medieval navigation had always relied on oral tradition, pilots passing down knowledge through ballads and rhymes, their secrets guarded like family heirlooms. The Dauphine's wreck exposed the flaw in that system. Human memory was fallible, especially when soaked in wine. Shipowners, tired of losing fortunes to drunken guesswork, began hiring arithmeticians, men who could calculate positions using the newfangled method of dead reckoning. These weren't just scribes, they were the first professional navigators, their salaries tied to accuracy rather than bravado. The age of the charismatic, hard-drinking pilot was ending, replaced by men who trusted ink over instinct. But the ocean, ever the trickster, had one final jest. Decades later, salvagers probing Cape Fear's waters found the Dauphine's remains not on the sandbar where she'd grounded, but a mile south. Leclerc's fatal error wasn't drunkenness alone. It was failing to account for the Labrador Current's relentless pull, a force no logbook could fully predict. The sea had tolerated humanity's new rules, then quietly reminded them who wrote the oldest ones. The Strait of Gibraltar had always been a place of uneasy truce where Christian and Moorish ships often passed in wary silence, their shared fear of the sea outweighing centuries of conflict. But in the autumn of 1530, the ocean itself chose sides. A fleet of 12 Moorish vessels, packed with families fleeing the Spanish Inquisition, hugged the coast near Cadiz, their captains counting each mile as a gift. Then, without warning, the horizon vanished. Survivors would later describe it as a wall of water, taller than the minarets of Granada, rising from calm seas like some vengeful god's hand. In seconds, the wave slammed broadside into the convoy, snapping masts like twigs and rolling ships onto their beams with the indifference of a child flipping toy boats in a bath. 11 vessels vanished beneath the foam. The 12th, miraculously, washed ashore with half its passengers clinging to the wreckage, their horrified accounts the only proof such a wave had ever existed. What made this disaster more than a tragic footnote was its defiance of all known maritime logic. Medieval sailors understood storms, even feared rogue currents, but a single wave, rising from nowhere to dwarf castles. It sounded like superstition until the survivors' stories matched too perfectly to dismiss. Their descriptions of a mountain with a lip like a crumbling cliff, of the sea sucking its breath in, just before the strike became grist for a debate that would rage for centuries. Were these the exaggerations of traumatized minds, or evidence of something science hadn't yet named? The answer wouldn't come until 1995, when an oil rig off Norway measured an 84-foot wave, dubbed the Dropner wave, proving what the Cadiz refugees had sworn was true all along. Freak waves weren't myths, they were mathematical inevitabilities, rare but ruthless collisions of currents and swells. The sea, it seemed, had kept its deadliest trick hidden until humanity developed the tools to see it. Yet the Cadiz disaster's true legacy lay in the survivors' unintended gift, a checklist for survival. The lone surviving ship had two critical advantages. Its captain had lashed passengers below decks, preventing them from being swept overboard, and its cargo had been meticulously balanced, allowing it to right itself after the roll. These weren't just lucky choices, they were proto-safety protocols gleaned from hard experience and now etched into maritime law. Modern ships, from container vessels to cruise liners, still follow their blueprint: weighted keels, secured hatches, and the unglamorous but life-saving practice of storm lashing. The Moorish refugees couldn't have known it, but their trauma would save countless lives not by conquering the wave, but by teaching humanity how to endure its fury. But the ocean reserves its cruelest lessons for those who mistake preparation for control. In 1588, the Spanish Armada would learn this the hard way, not from a rogue wave, but from a force equally unpredictable, the wind itself. And this time, the stakes wouldn't be a single fleet, but the fate of empires. The pilgrim ship Santa Maria de la Rosa should have been a floating testament to faith, her decks crammed with hopeful travelers clutching rosaries, their voices rising in hymns as they sailed toward Santiago de Compostela. But devotion proved no match for greed. On that fateful morning in 1545, the ship's master had ignored every warning, packing 800 souls onto a vessel built for half that number. When a sudden squall struck off Cape Finisterre, the overloaded hull listed violently, its scuppers overwhelmed by torrents of seawater. Within minutes, the Santa Maria vanished beneath the waves, taking all but a dozen survivors with her. The sea had delivered a brutal sermon. Piety couldn't float a ship. This tragedy exposed a grim truth about medieval travel. Passengers were cargo, and cargo meant profit. Pilgrimage ships operated in a legal gray area, their owners charging by the head with no regard for capacity. Eyewitness accounts from the few who escaped painted a nightmare, families clinging to each other as water rose waist-high, the ship's own lifeboats bolted down to make room for more paying customers. The outcry reached the halls of Emperor Charles V, who demanded answers from the ship's owners. Their defense: the Pilgrims insisted on boarding. It was a refrain that would echo through maritime courts for centuries, blaming victims for their own desperation. Yet from this horror emerged one of history's first passenger protections. By 1547, Spanish ports enforced the Ley de Passage, requiring ships to carry one lifeboat per 100 passengers and limiting occupancy to certified capacities. Inspectors now paced docks with measuring ropes, calculating deck space like tailors fitting a garment. The law even mandated that pilgrims be shown evacuation routes, a radical notion in an era when most travelers couldn't swim. These weren't just rules, they were the birth of modern passenger rights, written in the ink of drowned souls. Meanwhile, war at sea created its own brand of recklessness. That same year, off the coast of Brittany, an English warship chasing French prizes ignored its own stability limits, stacking cannons until its hull groaned. When a lucky shot from a fleeing merchantman struck its waterline, the ship capsized instantly, dragging 200 sailors into the depths. The lesson was clear: whether pilgrims or privateers, greed sank ships faster than storms. The Santa Maria's wreckage still lies scattered near Finisterre, the end of the earth, in Latin, a poetic grave for those who sought salvation, but found only the sea's indifference. Yet their legacy endures in every cruise ship muster drill, every airline safety card. The ocean had taught humanity a brutal but necessary lesson. Faith moves mountains, but only physics floats boats. And as Europe slowly learned to balance profit with prudence, another disaster was brewing in the Mediterranean, one where the greatest threat wouldn't be overcrowding or cannon fire, but an enemy no one could see creeping through the cracks of every wooden hull. The age of the shipworm had arrived, and its appetite would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. The San Salvador had been a beacon of mercy in the brutal Anglo-French wars, a repurposed merchant vessel with red crosses painted boldly on its sails, ferrying wounded soldiers from the front lines to Calais. But on the night of July 8, 1552, those same sails became funeral shrouds, a stray lantern knocked over by a medic rushing to tend a screaming patient ignited the straw bedding. Within minutes, flames raced through the ship's tar-coated timbers, trapping hundreds of wounded men below decks. The screams carried across the water to nearby warships, but no one could reach them in time. By dawn, the San Salvador was a blackened skeleton, its hull still smoldering as it slipped beneath the waves. The sea, which had spared these men from battle, claimed them in a far crueler way. This catastrophe forced military planners to confront an uncomfortable truth. Goodwill wasn't enough to protect the vulnerable. Medieval medical ships were afterthoughts, cramped, flammable, and often staffed by untrained orderlies. The San Salvador's burning revealed how easily compassion could turn to ash. But from this failure emerged one of history's quieter revolutions, the dedicated hospital ship. Venetian engineers studying the wreck pioneered hulls lined with wet sand between double planking to slow fires. Spanish shipwrights replaced straw with seaweed-stuffed mattresses that resisted sparks. Most crucially, medical bays were relocated to the upper decks, with wide, ramped exits, a design still seen in modern naval hospitals. The sea had demanded specialization, and humanity, for once, listened. Yet the tragedy's true legacy lay in its timing. Just months after the fire, the Treaty of Boulogne temporarily halted hostilities between England and France. With the guns silenced, shipwrights turned their attention from cannons to cot frames, from ramming prows to ventilation shafts. The peace, though fragile, allowed ideas to cross enemy lines. A French design for copper-lined surgery tables easy to sterilize with seawater was quietly adopted by English vessels. A Dutch innovation involving hemp ropes soaked in vinegar to slow flame spread appeared in Spanish fleets. War had exposed the need, but peace provided the space to innovate. But the ocean reserves its cruelest ironies for those who grow complacent. In 1555, a Portuguese hospital ship named Nossa Senhora da Cura, outfitted with every new safety feature, sank not to fire, but to a forgotten lesson: overloading. Packed with refugees fleeing Moroccan coastal raids, the ship's carefully designed weight limits were ignored in the chaos of evacuation. The sea, it seemed, would always find fresh ways to humble human plans. As Europe's navies absorbed these hard lessons, another threat was rising, not from flames or waves, but from the very wood that kept them afloat. In the docks of Antwerp, shipwrights began noticing strange tunnels riddling their hulls, as if the timber itself were rotting from within. The age of the shipworm had arrived, and its appetite would rewrite naval history in ways no one could predict. The Santa Catarina do Monte sign, "I should have been the pride of Portugal's spice fleet," a carack so laden with pepper and cinnamon that her wake left the sea shimmering with golden dust. But on that moonless night near Madagascar in 1567, the ocean played its cruelest trick: silence. No crashing waves, no howling wind, just the faintest shudder as the ship's hull kissed something unseen. By dawn, 6 vessels of the convoy sat motionless, their keels lodged in a labyrinth of razor-sharp coral that hadn't existed on any chart. The reef, grown silently over decades, had become a predator, one that struck without warning and left no survivors. This disaster revealed a flaw in medieval navigation that storms never could: the sea's ability to reshape itself. Coral grew faster than cartographers could chart, and sailors who relied on decades-old maps were essentially blind. But the loss of the Santa Catarina sparked an innovation as meticulous as it was revolutionary: the Livro dos Baixos, the Book of Shallows. Portuguese hydrographers, working with Arab and Swahili pilots, began documenting reefs not as static hazards, but living entities. They noted growth rates, seasonal changes, even the way certain corals glowed faintly under moonlight, a natural lighthouse for wary captains. These weren't just maps, they were living documents, updated annually and bound in wax-sealed ledgers that traveled with every fleet. The ocean had taught humanity to respect its impermanence, yet the reef's most insidious lesson lay in its timing. Just 2 years earlier, the same waters had been declared safe by a Venetian navigator whose charts were considered gospel. His error wasn't carelessness, it was assuming the sea would wait for human schedules. The disaster forced a reckoning with the limits of knowledge. Suddenly, pilots began consulting not just their own logs, but the oral histories of Malagasy fishermen who'd watched the reef's tendrils stretch toward the surface for generations. The best charts, it turned out, were written in memories, not ink. But while Portugal adapted, nature was already plotting its next move. In the icy waters of the North Atlantic, a different kind of silent killer was emerging, one that didn't grow but rotted. Shipworms, those relentless burrowers of wood, were multiplying at an unprecedented rate, their tunnels turning mighty hulls into fragile honeycombs. The ocean's final lesson wouldn't be about what it added, but what it took away, and so we arrive at Disaster 27, the one that struck closest to home. Because sometimes the greatest threat isn't the sea's wrath, but our own blindness to its quietest warnings. The winter of 1595 didn't arrive, it attacked. Londoners woke one December morning to find the Thames transformed, its usual murky flow locked beneath ice so thick it could bear the weight of ox carts. But the real horror lay downstream at the Pool of London, where hundreds of merchant ships heavy with coal from Newcastle had been trapped mid-river when the freeze came. As temperatures plummeted, the ice thickened like a vice, squeezing hulls until timbers screamed and split. By Epiphany, the river resembled a graveyard of listing masts and shattered planking, the holds of precious coal spilling into the frozen depths. The city's lifeblood, quite literally, had been strangled in its tracks. What made this disaster so catastrophic wasn't just the loss of ships, it was the domino effect that followed. Coal wasn't a luxury in Tudor London. It was the fuel that baked bread, boiled dye for cloth, and kept the furnaces of blacksmiths roaring. Within weeks, bakeries shuttered for lack of heat, textile workers rioted over frozen vats, and the price of a single bushel of coal soared to a week's wages. The freeze exposed a vulnerability no one had considered. A bustling port city could starve in plain sight, not from lack of food, but from the absence of something as humble as fuel. Yet from this chaos emerged one of history's quieter revolutions, the birth of strategic stockpiling. Queen Elizabeth's Privy Council, desperate to prevent future collapses, mandated that all ports maintain frost stores, emergency coal depots kept above high water marks where ice couldn't reach. These weren't just piles of fuel, they were early examples of critical infrastructure, guarded like royal armories and dispersed across the city to prevent bottlenecks. The system worked so well that when the Thames froze again in 1608, London barely blinked. The lesson was clear: resilience wasn't about resisting nature's whims, but anticipating them. The disaster also sparked an unlikely architectural shift. Wealthy merchants, tired of relying on volatile shipments, began building homes with dual hearths, one for coal, another for wood, while bakers experimented with peat as a backup fuel. Even the Royal Navy took note, redesigning dockyards to include insulated storage sheds. The freeze had forced innovation not through invention, but through redundancy, a principle that would later define everything from military logistics to modern power grids. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the frozen fleet was its psychological impact. For centuries, London had seen itself as a city tamed, its river bridged, its marshes drained, its commerce unrivaled. The ice proved otherwise. In the archives of the Worshipful Company of Coal Merchants, a single ledger entry from that winter captures the humbling truth: God sends the frost and man must bear it. The sea might be conquered, but winter always had the final word. And so, as the thaw finally came in March, carrying the wreckage of the fleet out to the North Sea, Londoners faced a new reality. Their wealth, their wars, even their daily bread depended on forces beyond human control. The Little Ice Age wasn't just a weather event, it was a reckoning, one that echoed in every stocked warehouse and double-chimneyed house for generations to come. The ocean storms could sink ships, but ice could cripple empires without leaving a single wave behind. From storms to mutinies, these 27 disasters reveal a hidden truth. Medieval naval history wasn't just shaped by kings and conquests, but by the sea's relentless classroom. Each catastrophe, from the frozen fleets of London to the exploding powder rooms of Venice, forced humanity to adapt or perish. Think of the humble lighthouse, its beam cutting through fog, not just a navigational aid, but a monument to ships lost to unseen reefs. Or consider the weather app on your phone. Its forecasts descended from sailors who learned to read the sky's warnings only after tempests swallowed their comrades whole. Even modern cargo ships, with their watertight compartments and standardized manifests, owe their design to medieval merchants who watched their fortunes sink because no one thought to balance the load. The sea's lessons were harsh, but they sculpted the modern world in ways we rarely notice. Those tedious maritime laws about lifeboats and passenger limits. They were written in ink stained by tears after overloaded pilgrim ships vanished beneath the waves. The global trade routes we take for granted. They were carved by disasters that exposed the fragility of old networks, pushing explorers to find safer paths. Every time a ship's captain checks a compass or consults a tide chart, they're standing on the shoulders of sailors who never made it home, their mistakes becoming our wisdom. But perhaps the most profound legacy of these tragedies lies in their reminder of humility. For all our technology, the ocean remains unconquered. A medieval storm that could sink an armada still lurks in every modern hurricane warning. A rogue wave like the one that crushed the Moorish refugees off Cadiz still haunts today's cargo ships. The sea doesn't care about our arrogance, it only rewards those who listen. So the next time you walk past a harbor or trace a route on a map, pause for a moment. Behind every convenience, every rule, every innovation, there's a story, a shipwreck, a blaze, a desperate act of survival. History isn't just dates and battles, it's the sum of hard-won lessons whispered across centuries by the waves themselves. If these untold stories resonated with you, share them. The past is too rich to forget, and the sea's voice too powerful to ignore. And if you're hungry for more hidden chapters of history, subscribe, because the tides of time never stop rolling in, and neither should our curiosity.